Hi, this is the Reverend Dr. Duane Alexander Miller in Madrid with the beautiful wall of art for my children behind me. And I am speaking with Dr. Matthew Hoskin. Matthew, you've written a very interesting book. I don't know, I read it on PDF. Yeah, show that to us. Look at that. How many pages long is that thing?
This thing, including the indices, is 516 pages. So if you cut out indices and bibliography, it's only 470 or something, 468.
Yeah, impressive. And really about one of the most fascinating and important and influential characters in the history of Christianity, whether Orthodox or Catholic or Protestant. And tell us just very briefly about your own Christian orientation and what you're doing there in Canada. It's interesting because you and I got to know each other in Edinburgh. I'm in Spain, you're in Canada. So it just shows how the University of Edinburgh spreads influence.
Yes, yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to have us from Edinburgh and then to the world. So my own church background though is I'm baptized, confirmed, and communicating member of the Anglican Church of Canada to this day. I was recently working at a different church, but that contract and job ended, so I'm back at my sort of regular Anglican parish. Actually, I'm going to the church that my great-grandfather was the priest in the 1930s and 40s, so that's kind of cool. It's not my old stomping grounds, but it was like, my grandma's stomping grounds is the church that my grandparents got married in. So that's kind of one of the cool things about being part of these old historic denominations is the actual living tradition that I get to be part of here as an Anglican in Canada. So yeah.
Excellent. And I've got to say the name of the place that you live.
Thunder Bay.
Isn't that like the coolest thing? It just reminds me of like a ride at an amusement park, Thunder Bay, just Madrid. Like people are like, well, what does that name Madrid mean? We don't really know. Probably like a medieval village. No one knows. That's how it is with Madrid. But Thunder Bay, man, it's pretty boss.
Thunder Bay,
great.
Yeah.
So you did your doctoral work and you composed this great tome. Collection, archive of the writings of Pope Leo. What inspired you to do this? What got you interested in this person in particular, given that, across the history of the church, there are literally thousands of other figures you could have chosen. What attracted you to Leo?
So what attracted me to Leo originally is the fact that I realized that he was one of the main architects of the Council of Chalcedon, which is one of the ecumenical councils of 451. And ecumenical councils are these big gatherings. I mean, I know Alex knows this, but they're like these big gatherings of bishops who get together from as much of the inhabited world as possible to deal with contentious issues of theology and church discipline. And so the Council of Chalcedon met in 451 to deal with some Christological heresies that had arisen in the years leading up to it, and to say that, in fact, indeed, Christ exists in two natures without confusion and without division, that he is a perfect God and perfect man as a single hypostasis, a single persona, subsisting as that. So, and so Leo was the architect of that, and I thought, that's pretty cool. And I had heard that it is also the best documented event in ancient history, which is true, basically, because we have all of the council acts in both Latin and Greek. So, I mean, they would have been conducted in Greek, but we have Latin translations that are from within a century or even a few within a decade, maybe. And then letters back and forth everywhere. Anyway, so I was really excited about Chalcedon as an event, and I thought the theology was important. And I heard that Leo hadn't had his letters edited or had the manuscripts of them looked at since 1753. And so I thought, well, that is a gap in the scholarly tradition. So I chose Leo.
So I've actually been in Chalcedon. I stayed there. It is today a neighborhood of the huge city of Istanbul. named either like Karikoi or Karakoi, which to Western ears, they sound like the same place, but trust me, they're different places. They have different ferry stations and bus stations. But I understand that in Turkish, and this could be totally wrong, it means like the Frog Creek. So have you actually been to Chalcedon, that particular neighborhood of Istanbul?
Sadly, no, this is one of the big disappointments of my life, is never to have been to Istanbul at all. Even though
We'll,
I
we'll,
sort of,
we'll go there.
okay.
Good. So tell us a little bit about Leo. I mean, who is this person? I mean, he's living in one of the most influential centuries of the entire history of the Christian church, because not only do you have Chalcedon, 20 years earlier, you have Ephesus, you have the robber council of Ephesus. We're not going to go into all that stuff. But I mean, this is like a key thing for, the standard seminarian who's learning about incarnation and Trinity and who is Jesus Christ and what does it mean for Jesus Christ to be the Son of God. This is one of the key centuries, maybe the key century for that whole question. So how does this guy Leo end up being the Bishop of Rome? And in those days, and I learned this from reading the extensive biography that you have in your book, which is amazing and really good.
Thanks.
That the Bishop of Rome was influential, but it didn't have the status that it would have later on, at least at the beginning of the century. So who is this guy Leo?
Yeah, so well, Leo was he was Bishop of Rome from 440 to 461. So that's like, he's like mid-century right there. And he is basically, he's just an energetic bishop. He's probably, as far as bishops of Rome go, relatively young. So the average age for most of ecclesiastical history, bishops of Rome tend to be 60 years or older, which means that your average episcopate is less than 7 years. So guys who are around for 21 years are able to do a lot more than most of the others. That's one thing to just sort of imagine. But he sort of had already been involved in diplomacy and hobnobbing with the great and powerful. At the time when he was acclaimed Bishop of Rome, he was actually on a diplomatic mission to Gaul, because there was a threat of civil war between two of the major generals there, and he was there actually brokering a peace between two Roman generals at the time when Pope Sixtus III died. And then the people by popular acclaim said they wanted Leo to be Pope, which is sort of, he was probably the unofficially designated successor anyway, because he held the role of archdeacon at Rome. And so then and quite often the guy who's archdeacon, unless he's like a really bad dude, ends up being the next bishop in Rome in ancient times. Obviously, it's completely different now because the whole college of cardinals and all sorts of crazy stuff. So Leo has this sort of, he's already working as a diplomat. In fact, his first trace of him in the historical record even was when he was an acolyte. He was actually sent to deliver a letter to St. Augustine of Hippo. So he's a guy who gets around for like his whole church career. He's like a career churchman. And so when he becomes Bishop of Rome, he starts answering letters, he starts writing letters, he takes an active interest in affairs beyond the city of Rome, beyond his own metropolitan area. So as an archbishop, the Bishop of Rome actually has sort of south of the Po River in Italy, I think, or somewhere, maybe, anyway, there's a sort of mid to south Italy and Sicily are part of his sort of, even if he weren't claiming anything higher than being Metropolitan of Rome, that's his metropolitan district. But Leo starts looking further than that as well. And so he is out looking for things. And one of the things that we think is a big turning point for him as a rising star is the death of St. Cyril of Alexandria, who is one of he's a hotshot theologian in the 5th century. He's the guy who took down Nestorius, who sort of starts to articulate how can we, in an orthodox, balanced way, say that Jesus is one person, a single hypostasis in Greek, but nevertheless, he is both God and man. How do you do that without them getting swallowed up? And for Cyril, the big thing was continually stressing the unity of the person of Christ. And so when St. Cyril dies, this is sort of the moment for there could be some new major figure in church politics and theology. And basically Leo decides, he's going to start rising to that task. And amongst the things that he does that are make him different from other bishops of Rome is he also publishes all of his sermons, not all. I assume he preached more than 98 sermons, but he publishes his sermons, and no bishop of Rome before Leo had actually published his own sermons. So we have no idea what they were preaching. Some people think they didn't preach. That seems bizarre that they wouldn't be preaching. Leo himself says that is one of the main duties of a bishop. It is to preach. And so Leo is publishing his sermons in 2 different recensions in his own lifetime. He revises them. And he starts writing letters. He writes a letter to the new bishop of Alexandria, a guy called Dioscorus.
Can I jump in with a quote from your book here?
Do.
I love this. This is from, I read the PDF on Kindle. So this is from Location 293. No bishop of Rome before Gregory the Great, hotshot, that's my insertion, with a surviving corpus of 860 letters, has a better epistolary survival rate. So I just want to make sure that people listening to this realize that this guy is, I mean, his letters were spread far and wide and were preserved. There presumably were other papal letters, but maybe they were too specific, maybe they were not interesting enough, or maybe the popes, some certain popes before and after Leo didn't write as many letters. But I mean, this person, because of his devotion to writing, had an enormous influence. So I just wanted to jump in with that. I love that quote. I didn't know that. I mean, I've taught church history, so I knew about the influence of Leo, but I didn't realize that. Go ahead.
So, and actually that brings to mind an important point about Leo and why do so many letters survive, right? So Leo's writing letters, but we assume everyone is writing letters. And I think there are 2 things perhaps that make Leo's letters survive and why he ends up being such a lasting thing. And one of them is actually what Giovanni Busi, who published the first printing of any of Leo's letters in 1468, he calls him the Christian Cicero, which is sort of extraordinarily high praise, but it is his Latinity is lovely. He is readable. Not all late antique Latin can claim that. We'll just say that. It's like stylistically, Leo is running on the same rails as people like Cicero and Augustine, that he's not going, there's a strong taste for floridity in 5th century Latin, which some of us like me, I actually enjoy, but most moderns from the Renaissance onward find distasteful. Leo isn't one of those. So, which means that in his day as well, it's easier to read and easier to understand than some of his contemporary, like guys who are just going over the top to show how good they are at writing. So that I think is one thing. And then the other thing is actually, the other main thing for why so many survive is the Council of Chalcedon. Because when all the things get rolling with after Cyril's death, and people are trying to consolidate this Cyrilline legacy in theology, there's this monk in Constantinople called Eutyches, and he starts saying some crazy stuff that he thinks is what Cyril would have said. And people start dividing as to whether they think Eutyches is in line with the tradition and whether he's not in line with the tradition. And this 448, this is Leo's time to shine. And sort of, we don't need to, I don't know if we want to go into all the details of how we get from 448 to 451, but that moment is when.
So I have a question about the Tome of Leo later on, because I mean, in terms of like influential books, that's one of the main ones. But Dr. Hoskin, Matthew, can I just ask you a question about your own personal style of research as a historian first, before we get to the Tome of Leo?
Okay, yeah.
So one thing that I noticed from your writing is that you seem to appreciate the scholars of previous centuries, even many centuries ago, who tried to put together collections of the letters, of the epistolary, the documents of Pope Leo. And honestly, as someone who has read a lot of church history, even though my main thing is Old Testament at this moment, I have taught church history in the past, is that I find that it's quite common to find people who are very almost insulting for previous generations of historians. Why is it that you can say, yes, there were deficiencies, but overall we should be appreciative of these different archivists and collectors and maybe translators even of the documents of Leo?
Well, so one of the reasons I would say that is that they're better at Latin than most of us alive today. That's like one of the basic things. So you can say someone like, so the Ballerini, there are these two guys, Giacomo and Pietro Ballerini. They put together the last almost complete, we found 2 letters since then, but otherwise complete edition of Leo's letters in 1753. With extraordinarily large apparatus and all sorts of weird problems. I'm not going to pretend like it's perfect. And even if it were perfect, we have so many more manuscripts, we would have to go back and through and do a new edition of Leo's letters again. But their editorial judgment seems to be sound simply through being good at Latin. Like they don't need, like, they're not sitting around with, say, like Martin West's textual criticism and editorial technique, obviously not written for centuries. Really great book. I recommend it to anyone who wants to do any text editing. But at a certain level, these guys, people in the 18th century, are still inhabiting this Latin world, right? Like this, people are still talking in Latin in places like in universities and stuff like that. I mean, we're a few decades beyond Johann Sebastian Bach doing his job interview in Latin, but people are, like places like Italy and Germany actually are still a strong Latinate culture. And so then that you feel that like you have to have really good grounds for dismissing any of their readings of the text, which, I mean, I do at times, but I need to make sure that I know what I'm talking about because they're good at Latin and they just had access to a lot of manuscripts and they had time the way that a modern academic doesn't always. So because of publisher or parish and all of those things too. So that's one of the main reasons.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I actually enjoyed, I mean, my Latin is not, I'm sure not as good as yours, but I have studied Latin for an extensive period of time. And I enjoyed reading some of the phrases from Leo in Latin, which you quote. And yeah, he would just have these long phrases and then, put the verb at the end, which, you don't necessarily have to do, but I noticed that and it was beautiful to see that. For people listening to this talk, this interview, Latin was becoming less and less common in terms of a literate, fluid language from, I would say, the 5th century on. Would you agree with that?
It's sort of like it's a weird. There are like 2 things going on at the same time. And I would say starting in the 5th century, we have 2 things are going on. One is Latin is becoming more widespread on the one hand. So like your peasant in Gaul until this time, like this is a Peter Brown argument, first of all, just for anyone who cares, that your peasant in Gaul until the 5th century, probably speaking some native language that Asterix would have spoken, right? But starting now until some point in the Middle Ages, they start speaking some version of Latin that eventually becomes French, right? So this is when Latin starts diverging in sort of France, well, in Italy, in Gaul, and Spain, but it's also when you get these these literary Latins start being born, like things like people like Sidonius Apollinaris, who's I like, but is a very artificial author, is writing. But then also with the evangelization of places like Ireland that were never in the empire, you start getting people who have never had to speak Latin in a marketplace, reading and writing in Latin. And so you have these 2 things happening where spoken Latin is, or 3 things, I guess. Spoken Latin is becoming more widespread amongst the common population of the crumbling empire. And then literate Latin is going in sort of 2 directions. Upper crust aristocrat, there's the upper crust aristocrat rhetorical Latin, which is florid and crazy. And then you have the people who never spoke Latin at all start writing Latin at the same time. So these are the 3 things happening with Latin. One of them leads to Italian, French, and Spanish. And the other one leads to Hiberno-Latin literature, which is its own interesting creature out there, kind of thing.
Yeah, so some of the prayers of St. Patrick, a famous missionary, and quite early, they're famous for being rather poor Latin, but for whatever reason, Patrick felt that he should write those prayers, those abjurations, those apotropaic invocations of God against witches and mages and so on in Latin. And we have many relics of that in Spanish, which migo es cum, mi, cum. They just ended up repeating these words that were extraneous.